This collection was posted on Reddit by the user searchandrescuewoods and was originally narrated by the YouTuber Corpse Husband, which is where I first discovered this amazing collection of stories. I hope you all enjoyed on the spookiest of all nights, and without further ado, let's jump into it. I wasn't sure where else to post these stories, so I figured I'd share them here. I've been a search and rescue officer for a few years now, and along the way I've seen some things that I think you guys will be interested in. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time they just wander off the path, or slip down a small cliff, or they can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old stay where you are thing, and they don't wander far, but I've had 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both bother me a lot, and I use them for motivation to search even harder on the missing persons cases I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time, both the kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked her where her brother was, she told us that he'd been taken away by the Bear Man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the Bear Man and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched that area for weeks, and it was one of the longest calls I've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, and she'd never come back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours, calling her name, before they called for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could have possibly gone, because neither her mother or grandpa saw her come down. A few times, I've been out on my own searching with a canine, and they've tried to lead me straight up cliffs. Not hills, not even rock faces, straight, sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases we usually find the person on the other side of the cliff, or miles away from where the canine has led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's sort of strange. One particularly sad case involved a recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what had happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance, and she let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and a part of her had died with the daughter. I heard from another search and rescue officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. She couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. I was teamed up with another search and rescue officer because we'd received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come down from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get where we figured he'd be. We found him trapped in a small crevice with a broken leg. It was not pleasant. He'd been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was obviously infected. We were able to get him to the chopper, and I heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He kept talking about how he'd been doing fine, and when he got to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment, and he was wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face, it was just blank. He freaked out, and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he'd fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night, climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible, muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. One of the scariest things I've ever had happen to me involved the search for a young woman who'd gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out until late at night because a dog had picked up her scent. When we found her, she was curled up under a large, rotted log. She was missing her shoes and pack, and she was clearly in shock. She didn't have any injuries, and we were able to get her to walk all the way back to us to the base. Along the way, she kept looking behind us and asking why that big man with black eyes was following us. We couldn't see anyone, so we just wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock. But the closer we got to the base, the more agitated this woman got. She kept asking me to tell him to stop making faces at her. At one point, she stopped and turned around and started yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She wasn't going to go with him, she said, and she wouldn't give us to him. We finally got her to keep moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic and deeper. It was almost insect-like. I don't really know how else to describe it. When we were within the sight of the base ops, the woman turns to me, and her eyes are about as wide as I can imagine a human could open them. She touches my shoulder and says, "He says to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck." I have a very small scar on the base of my neck, and it's mostly hidden under my collar, and I have no idea how this woman saw it. Right after she says it, I hear that weird coughing right in my ear, and I just almost jumped out of my skin. I hustled toward the ops, trying not to show how freaked out I was, but I have to say, I was really happy when we left the area that night. This is the last one I'll tell, and it's probably the weirdest story I have. Now, I don't know if this is true in every search and rescue unit, but in mine, it's sort of an unspoken, regular thing we run into. You can try asking about it with other search and rescue officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably won't say anything about it. We've been told not to talk about it by our superiors, so at this point, we've all gotten used to it, that it doesn't even seem weird anymore. On just about every case where we're really far into the wilderness, I'm talking 30 to 40 miles, at some point we'll find a staircase in the middle of the woods. It's almost like if you took the stairs in your house, cut them out, and put them in the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw some, and the other officer just told me not to worry about it, that it was normal. Everyone I asked said the same thing. I wanted to go check them out, but I was told very emphatically that I should never go near any of them. I just sort of ignore them now when I run into them because it's happened so frequently. I have a lot more stories, and I suppose if anyone's interested, I'll tell them tomorrow. If anyone has any theories about these stairs, or if you've seen them too, let me know. This is now starting. I'm a search and rescue officer for the U.S. Forest Service, and I have some stories to tell, part 2. So I logged back on tonight and was blown away by the staggering amount of interest this seems to have generated. First off, I'll address a few things that you guys have brought up. There's been an overwhelming amount of people mentioning the similarity between some of my stories and those of David Paulides. I assure you I'm not trying to rip him off in any way. I've got nothing but respect for the guy. He's actually what inspired me to write this, because I can verify a lot of the things he talks about. We do have a lot of these strange missing person cases, and most of the time they aren't solved. Either that or we find them in places they have no business being. I personally haven't been on many of the calls like that, but I'll share the few that I've seen, and a story my friend told me that relates to this. There was a lot of feedback about the stairs, so I'll touch on that briefly here. I'll also include a story. They come in a variety of shapes, sizes, styles, and condition. Some are pretty dilapidated, just ruins, but others are brand new. I saw one set looked like they came out from a lighthouse. They were metal and spiral, almost old-fashioned. The stairs don't go up infinitely, or farther than I can see, but some sets are taller than others. Like I said before, just imagine the stairs in your house, as if someone cut and pasted them in the middle of nowhere. I don't have any pictures, it's never really occurred to me to try again after the first time, and I don't really feel like risking my job over it. I'll try again in the future, but I really can't promise anything. A few people expressed confusion about the guy who ran into the man with no face. Just to clarify, when the climber ascended and reached the top of the peak, he saw another man in a parka and ski pants. This was the man with no face. Sorry about confusing wording of that story. I'll try to avoid that in the future. Alright, on to the news stories. As far as missing persons go, I say about half these calls I get are related to that. The others are rescue calls, people who fall down cliffs and hurt themselves, get injured by fire. You wouldn't believe how often this happens, mostly drunk kids, get bitten or stung by animals or insects. We're a tight team, and we have veterans who are excellent in finding signs of lost people. That's what makes these cases where we never find any trace of them so frustrating. One in particular was upsetting for all of us, because we did find a trace of them, but it just led us to more questions than answers. An older man had been hiking alone on a well-established trail, but his wife called to say he hadn't come home when he should have. Apparently, he had a history of seizures, and she was worried that he hadn't taken his medication, and suffered one of them out on the trail. Before you ask, I have no idea why he thought it was okay to go out alone, or why she didn't go with him. I don't ask about that kind of thing because past a certain point, it really doesn't matter. Someone is missing, and it's my job to find them. We went out in a standard search formation, and it wasn't long before one of our vets found signs of the guy that had gone off trail. We grouped up and followed him, spreading out in a fan to make sure we were covering as much ground as possible. Suddenly, a call comes back on the radio telling us all to head back to the vet's location, and we come right away, because this usually means the missing person is injured, and we need a full team to help get them out safely. We meet back up, and the vet is just standing at the base of a tree with his hands on the side of his head. I ask my buddy what's going on, and he points up into the branches of the tree. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. But there's a walking stick dangling from a branch at least 30 feet off the ground. The little strap thing on the handle has been looped around the branch, and it's just hanging there. There's no way a guy could have tossed it up that far, and we don't have any other signs that he's still in the area. We call into the tree, but it's obvious no one's in it. We're all just sort of left scratching our heads. We kept searching for the guy, but we never found him. We even bring our canines out, and they lose his scent long before the tree. Eventually, the search is called off, because there are other calls we have to attend to, and past a certain point, there's not much we can do. The guy's wife called us every day for months, asking if we found her husband, and it was heartbreaking to hear her get more and more hopeless each time. I'm not sure why this call in particular was so upsetting, but I think it was just the sheer improbability of it. That and the questions that were raised. How in the hell did this guy's cane end up there? Did someone kill him and toss it up there as some kind of weird trophy? We did our best to find him, but it's almost like a taunt. We still talk about that one from time to time. Missing kids are the most heartbreaking. Doesn't matter what circumstances they go missing under, it's never easy, and we always dread the ones we find deceased. It's not common, but it does happen. David Paulides talks about kids search and rescue teams find in places they shouldn't be, or couldn't be. I can honestly say that I've heard about this kind of thing happening more than I've seen it, but I'll share one of the ones I think about a lot that I witnessed personally. A mother and her 3 kids were out on a picnic in an area of the park that has a small lake. One is 6, one is 5, and the other is about 3. She's watching them all really closely, according to her, and she never lets them out of her sight at any time. She never saw anyone else in the area either, which is important. She packs their stuff up, and they start to head back to the parking area. Now, this lake is only about 2 miles into the woods, and it's on a very clearly established trail. It's almost impossible to get lost getting from the parking area to it, unless you're deliberately going off the path like an imbecile. Her kids are walking in front of her when she hears what sounds like something coming up the path behind her. She turns around, and in 4 or so seconds she's not looking, her 5-year-old son vanishes. She figures he stepped off the trail to pee or something, and she asks the other 2 where he went. They both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the woods next to them, took the kid's hand, and led him into the trees. The 2 remaining kids don't seem upset. In fact, she says later they seem like they've been drugged. They're sort of spacey and fuzzy. So of course, she freaks out, starts looking frantically in the area for her kid. Screaming his name, she says at one point she thinks she heard him answer. Now, obviously she can't go blindly running into the wood, she's got other 2 kids. So she calls the police and they send us out immediately. We respond, and we start the search for him. Over the course of this search, which spans miles, we never find a single trace of the kid. Canines don't pick up a scent, we don't find any clothing or broken bushes or literally anything that would signify a child being there. Of course, there's suspicion about the mother for a while, but it's pretty clear that she's completely destroyed by the whole thing. We look for this kid for weeks, with a lot of volunteer help, but eventually the search peters out and we have to move on. The volunteers keep searching though, and one day we get a call on the radio letting us know that a body has been found and needs to be recovered. They tell us location, and none of us can believe it. We figure it has to be a different kid, but we go out there, about 15 miles from the site where he vanished, and sure enough, we find the body of the kid we've been looking for. I have been trying to figure out how this kid got where he did ever since we found him, and I've never come back with an answer. A volunteer just happened to be in the area because he figured he might as well look in places no one else would think of on the off chance the body had been dumped. He comes up to the base of the trail, a tall, rocky slope, and halfway up, he sees something. He looks through his binoculars, and sure enough, it's the body of a little boy, stuffed in a little opening in a rock. He recognizes the color of the kid's shirt, so he knows right away that it's the missing boy. That's when he calls it in, and we're dispatched. It took us almost an hour to get this body down, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Not only was this kid 15 miles from where he'd started, there was no possible way he could have gotten up there on his own. The slope is treacherous, and it's hard for even us to get there without climbing gear. A 5-year-old boy had no way of getting up there, I'm certain. Not only that, but the kid doesn't have a scratch on him. His shoes are gone, but his feet aren't damaged or dirty. So it wasn't as if an animal dragged him up there. And from what we can tell, he hasn't been dead that long. He'd been out there over a month by that point, and it looked like he'd only been dead for, at most, a day or 2. The whole thing was unbelievably strange, and was one of the most disconcerting calls I've ever been on. We found out later the coroner determined the kid had died from exposure. He'd frozen to death, probably late at night 2 days before we found him. There were no suspects and no answers. To date, it's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. One of my first jobs as a trainee was a search op for a 4-year-old kid that had gotten separated from his mom. This is one of those cases where we knew we were going to find him because the dogs were on a strong scent trail, and we saw clear signs of that he was in the area. We ended up finding him in a small berry patch about a half a mile from where he'd last seen. The kid wasn't even aware he'd been wandering that far. One of the vets brought him back, which I was glad for because I'm not really good with kids. I find it hard to talk to them and keep them company. As my trainer and I are headed back, she decides to take me on a detour and show me one of the hot spots where we tend to find missing people. It's a natural dip in the land near a popular trail, and people will usually move downhill because it's easier. We hike out there, it's a few miles away, and we get there about an hour or so. As we're walking around the area, she's pointing out places she's found people in the past. I see something in the distance. Now this area we're in is about 8 miles from the main parking area, though there's back roads you can take to get closer if you don't want to hike that far. But we're on a state-protected land, which means there can't be any kind of commercial or residential development out here. The most you'll ever see is a fire tower or a makeshift shelter that homeless people think they can get away with building. But I can see from here that whatever this thing is has straight edges, and if there's one thing you learn quickly, it's that nature rarely makes straight lines. I point it out, and she doesn't say anything. She just hangs back and lets me wander over and check it out. I get within about 20 feet of it, and all the hair on my neck stands up. It's a staircase in the middle of the woods. In the proper context, it would literally be the most benign thing ever. It's just a normal staircase, with beige carpet and about 10 steps tall. But instead of being in a house, where it obviously should be, it's out here, in the middle of the woods. The sides aren't carpeted, obviously, but I can see the wood it's made of. It's almost like a video game glitch, where the house has failed to load completely and the stairs are the only thing visible. I stand there, and it's like my brain is working overtime to try to make sense of what I'm seeing. My trainer comes and stands next to me, and she just stands there casually, looking at it like it's the least interesting thing in the world. I ask her what the heck this thing is doing here, and she just chuckles. Get used to it, rookie. You're going to see a lot of them. I start to move closer, but she grabs my arm hard. I wouldn't do that, she says. Her voice is casual, but her grip is tight. I just stand there looking at her. You're going to see them all the time, but don't go near them. Don't touch them. Don't go up them. Just ignore them. I start to ask her about it, but something in the way she's looking at me tells that it's best if I don't. We end up moving on, and the subject doesn't come up for the rest of my training. She was right, though. I'd say every 5th call I go on, I end up running into these set of stairs. Sometimes they're relatively close to the path, maybe within 2 or 3 miles. Sometimes they're 20, 30 miles out, literally in the middle of nowhere, and I can only find them during the broadest searches or training weekend. They're usually in good condition, but sometimes it'll look like they've been out there for miles. All different kinds, all different sizes. The biggest I ever saw looked like they came out of a turn-of-the-century mansion and were at least 10 feet wide, with steps leading up at least 15 or 20 feet. I've tried talking about it with people, but they just don't give me the same response my trainer did. It's normal. Don't worry about it. They're not a big deal. But don't go close to them or go up them. When trainees ask me about it now, I give them the same response. I don't really know what else to tell them. I'm really hoping someday I get a better answer, but it hasn't happened yet. This is another one that was less spooky and more sad. A young man went missing late in winter, when realistically no one should be going that far out onto the trails. We close a lot of them, but some remain open year-round unless there's a ton of snow. We didn't opt for him, but we had at least about 6 feet of snow on the ground. It was an unusually heavy snow that year, and we knew it wasn't that likely we were going to find him until spring and when the thaw came. Sure enough, when the first big thaw came, a hiker reported a body a little ways off the main trail. We found him at the base of a tree in a pile of melted snow. I knew right away what happened, and it scared the living crap out of me. Most of you who ski or snowboard, or spend any time on a mountain, will probably have guessed too. When snow falls, it doesn't collect as thick in the areas beneath the branches. It happens most with fir trees, because they have a sort of closed umbrella shape. So what you won't end up with is space around the base of a tree that's filled with a mixture of loose, powdery snow, air, and branches. They're called tree wells, and they're not immediately obvious unless you know what you're looking for. We put up signs in the Welcome Center, big ones, letting people know how dangerous they are, but every year we get an unusual amount of snow, at least one person doesn't read them, or doesn't take the warning seriously, and we find out about it in spring. My best guess is that this young man was hiking and got tired, or maybe got a cramp from walking in the deep snow. He went to go sit at the base of a tree, not knowing that there was a tree well, and fell in. He got stuck with his feet up, and the surrounding snow caved in around him. Unable to free himself, he suffocated. It's called snow immersion suffocation, and it doesn't usually happen except in really deep snow. But if you get stuck in a weird position, like this guy did, even 6 feet of snow can be lethal. What scared me the most was imagining how he must have struggled, upside down, in the freezing cold. He didn't die quickly. The snow would have formed a dense, heavy pile on top of him, and would have been literally impossible to get out. As it got harder to breathe, he would have known what was happening. I can't even imagine how he was thinking in his last moments. A lot of my less outdoorsy friends want to know if I've ever seen the goat man while I've been out on calls. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, I've never had anything quite like that happen. I guess the closest thing was the whole black-eyed man thing, but I didn't see anything. However, there was one call where I had something kind of similar happen, but I'm not sure I'm willing to chalk it up to the goat man. We got in a report that an older woman had fainted along one of the trails and needed assistance getting back down to the main area. We hike up to where she's at, and her husband is just beside himself. He runs, well I guess more jogs to us, and tells us that he was a little bit off the trail, looking at something when his wife starts screaming behind him. He runs back to her where she's passed out on the trail. We get her on a backboard, and as we're getting her down to the welcome center, she comes to and starts screaming again. I calm her down and ask her what happened. I can't remember verbatim what she said, but essentially what happened was this. She'd been waiting for her husband when she started hearing this really strange sound. She said it kind of sounded like a cat, but it was off somehow. She couldn't quite figure out why. She went a little bit ahead to try to hear it better, and it sounded like it was coming closer. She said the closer it got, the more uneasy she was, until she finally figured out what was wrong. I do remember this next part because it was so weird that I don't think I could ever forget it if I tried. It wasn't a cat. It was a man saying the word meow over and over. Just meow, meow, meow. But it wasn't a man. It couldn't have been, because I've never heard a man make a buzz noise like that. I thought it was just my hearing aid going out, but it wasn't. I adjusted it and it still sounded all buzzy. It was awful. He was coming closer, but I couldn't see him, and the closer he got, the more scared I was. The last thing I remember was the shape coming out of the trees. I guess that's why I fainted. Now, obviously, I'm a little perplexed as to why this guy would be in the woods chanting meow, meow at people. So once we get out of the mountain, I tell my superior that I'm going to search the area, see if I can't find anything. He gives me the go-ahead, and I grab my radio and hike back down to where she fainted. I don't see anyone, so I keep going on about a mile more. When I head back, I go off the trail to see if I can figure out where she saw him coming from. It's almost sunset at this point, and I don't have any desire to be out at night alone, so I just sort of write it off and make a mental note to go check it out tomorrow. But as I'm headed back, I start to hear something in the distance. I stop, and I call out to anyone in the immediate area to identify themselves. The sound didn't come closer or get louder, but it sounded exactly like the man was saying, meow, meow, in this really odd monotone. As calm as it makes it sound, it was almost like that guy from South Park with the electrolarynx, Ned. I go off the trail in the direction I think it's coming from, but I never seem to get closer. It's almost like it's coming from all directions. Eventually it just sort of fades out, and I ended up going back to the welcome center. I didn't get any further reports like that, and even though I went back into the area, I never heard that exact sound again. I suppose it could have been some stupid kid out there messing with people, but even I have to admit it's weird. So this kind of turned into a massive wall of text, and for that I apologize. I wanted to get the stories my friend told me, and he does have some good ones, so I'll post those tomorrow evening. I also have a few more of my own I think you guys will like. I'm sorry to keep you all in suspense again, and hopefully these stories up here can make it... Hopefully the stories here make up for it and help you get through the next 24 hours until I post again. Edit. Since it seems like all of you would like to hear more, tomorrow I'll write up as many stories as I can to do a massive post. I'll include my friends' stories, I'll see if I can get a hold of a few more people who might have interesting things to talk about. I just wasn't sure how people felt about these big, huge walls of text, but if you're all okay with it, I'll post a lot of stories. Now beginning, I'm a search and rescue officer for the United States Forest Service, and I have some stories to tell, Part 3. Well, once again you guys have blown me away with your staggering amount of responses to my stories. There's no way I can respond to each of you individually, so I'm just going to address some common things again, and then we can move on to the stories. I'm going to write as many as I can think of, in addition to my friends' stories, and I will probably not update again until I get the chance to answer some questions that I have myself from my superiors. Alright, so the common questions I found you all had. I am not comfortable talking about where exactly I work, unfortunately. In all reality, some of the things I mention here could get me in a lot of trouble or fired, so it's better I just don't discuss too much. I will say that I'm in the United States, in an area that is comprised of a great deal of wilderness. We're talking hundreds of miles of thick forest with a mountain range and a few lakes. There is still a great amount of interest in the stairs, and luckily for you guys, my friend has a story that I think you'll all be very interested in. I'll go into that more at the end of this update. As for whether or not I have ever thought about asking my superiors about them, I have, but again, I don't want to risk my job. However, one of my former superiors no longer works as a search and rescue officer, and it's possible that he may be willing to talk to me about it. I'll be speaking to him later in the week, and I'll let you know what comes of that. As far as advice on becoming a search and rescue officer goes, I think the best advice I can give to you is contact your local Forest Service and see if they can offer training courses or what the qualifications are. I've been doing this for years, and I've started out as a volunteer helping on search and rescue operations. It's a great job, despite the occasional tragic situations, and I wouldn't want to do anything else. Alright, so let's move on to the stories. The first happened on a case that I went on right after I got out of training, and it was still pretty new to everything. Before I took this job, I was a volunteer, so I had a basic idea of what to expect, but on those calls, you're mostly dealing with finding lost people after vets have found signs of them. As a search and rescue officer, you go out for all kinds of cases, from animal bites to heart attacks. This case got called in early in the morning, from a young couple who were out on the trails that goes to the lake. The husband was completely hysterical, and we couldn't really figure out what was going on. We could hear the woman screaming in the background, and he was begging us to come up there right away. When we got there, we see him holding his wife, and she's got something in her arms. She's screaming these awful, almost animal-like screams, and he's sobbing. He sees us and he screams at us to help them, to please get an ambulance up there. Now, obviously, we can't just drive an ambulance up the walking path, so we ask him and his wife if his wife needs help, or if she can walk down on her own. He's still hysterical, but he managed to tell us that it's not his wife that needs help. I go over while one of the vets tries to calm him down, and I ask the wife what's going on. She's rocking, holding something, and just shrieking, over and over. I crouch down to see whatever she's holding, and it's covered in blood. That's when I notice the sling on her front, and my heart sinks. I ask her to tell me what's going on, and I sort of pry her arms gently so I can see what she's holding. It's her baby, obviously dead. His head is caved in on one side, and he's covered in scratches. Now, I've seen dead bodies before, but something about this whole situation hits me hard. I have to take a second to compose myself, and I get up and go get one of the other vets who's standing by. I tell him that it's a dead kid, and he sort of pats my shoulder and tells me he'll deal with it. It took us over an hour to get this woman to let us see her kid. Every time we try to take him from her, she flips out and tells us we can't have him, that it'll be okay if we just leave her alone and let her help him. But eventually, one of the vets manages to calm her down, and she gives us the body. We took it back to the med area, but when the EMT showed up, they told us that there was never any hope of saving the kid. He died instantly from trauma to the head. I was good buddies with one of the nurses who met them at the hospital, and she told me later what happened. Turns out the couple had been walking with the baby in the sling, and they stopped because the kid was fussing. The dad takes the kid out and is holding him, looking out over this little gully by the path. The mom comes to stand next to him, but she ends up slipping on some loose patch of soil, and she trips. She falls into the dad, who drops the kid, who ends up falling about 20 feet down this little gully onto the rocks by the bottom. The dad climbed down and recovered the kid, but he'd fallen right on his head and was dead by the time he got there. The baby was only about 15 months old. It was a total freak accident, a series of events that coalesced into one of the worst possible outcomes. Probably one of the more awful calls I've been on. I haven't seen a lot of animal bites in my time as a search and rescue officer, most because there aren't that many animals that come around this area. While there are many bears in the area, they tend to stay pretty far away from people, and sightings are highly unusual. Most of the animals you see are small ones, like coyotes, raccoons, or skunks. What we do see frequently, though, are moose, and let me tell you, moose are nasty. They'll chase after anything for any reason, and God help if you get between a female and its baby. One of the more amusing calls was of a guy who'd gotten chased down by an absolutely massive male moose and was stuck up in a tree. It took us almost an hour to get him down, and when he was finally on solid ground again, he looks up to me and says, "Damn, those moose are big up close." I guess it's not really a scary story, but I still laugh about that one. I honestly don't know how I'd forgotten about this story, but it is by far the scariest thing that's happened to me. I guess maybe I've tried so long to forget about it that it just didn't come to mind right away. As someone who literally spends all of their time in the woods, you don't ever want to let yourself get scared of being alone or out in the middle of nowhere. That's why when you have experience like this, you tend to just forget about them and move on. This is, to date, the only thing that's ever made me really seriously consider if this job is the right one for me. I don't really like talking about it much. I'll do the best I can to remember it all. As I recall, this took place right at the end of spring. It was a typical lost child call. A 4-year-old girl had wandered away from her family's campsite and had been missing for about 2 hours. Her parents were completely despondent and told us what most parents do. "My kid would never wander away. She's so good about staying close. She's never done anything like this before." We assured the parents that we'll do everything we can to find her, and we spread out in a standard search formation. I was partnered with one of my good buddies, and we were sort of casually holding conversation while we hiked. I know it sounds callous, but you do sort of become desensitized when you've done this long enough. It becomes the norm, and I think to a certain extent you have to learn to desensitize yourself in order to work this job. We searched for a good 2 hours, going well beyond where we think she'd be, and we come out of a small valley when something makes us both stop in unison. We freeze and look at each other, and there's almost a sensation like a plane depressurizing. My ears pop, and I have this odd sensation of being dropped about 10 feet. I start to ask my buddy if he felt that, but before I can, we hear the loudest sound I've ever heard in my life. It's almost like a freight train passing directly by us, but it's coming from every direction at once, including above and below us. He screams something to me, but I can't hear him over this deafening roar. Understandably freaked out, we look all around us, trying to find the source of the sound, but neither of us sees anything. Of course, my first thought is a landslide, but we're not near any cliffs, and even if we were, it would have hit us by now. The sound goes on, and we're trying to yell at each other, but even standing close together, we can't hear anything but this sound. Then, as suddenly as it starts, it stops, like someone threw a switch and cut it off. We stand there for a second, perfectly still, and slowly the normal sounds of the woods come back. He asks me what the heck just happened, but I just kind of shrug, and we stand there looking at each other for another minute. I get on the radio and ask if anyone else just heard the end of the world, but no one else hears it, even though we're all within shouting distance of each other. My buddy and I sort of shrug it off and keep going. About an hour later, we all check up on the radios, and no one's found the little girl. Most of the time we won't search when it gets dark, but because we don't have any kind of lead on her, a few of us decide to keep going, including me and my buddy. We keep close together, and we're calling out for her every couple of minutes. At this point, I'm hoping beyond hope that we find her, because while I may not like kids, the idea of them being all out alone in the dark is awful. The woods can be intimidating to kids in the daylight. At night, well, it's a whole different other beast. We're not seeing any signs of her, or getting any response. Around midnight, we decide to turn around and head back to the rendezvous point. We're about halfway back when my buddy stops and shines a light in front of us. It's a really thick deadfall, or a group of dead trees. I asked him if he's heard a response, but he just told me to be quiet a second and listen. I do, and in the distance I can hear what sounded like a kid crying. We both call the girl's name and listen for any kind of response, but it's just a really faint crying. We head in the direction of this deadfall and go around it, calling her name over and over. As we get closer to the crying, I start getting this weird feeling in my gut, and I tell my buddy that something isn't right. He tells me he feels the same way, but we can't figure out what it is. We stop where we are and call the girl's name again, and at the same time, we both figure it out. The crying is on a loop. It's the same little hitching sob, then wail, then quiet hiccup repeated over and over. It's exactly the same every time, and without saying another word, we both take off running. It's the only time I've ever lost my composure like that, but something about it was so incredibly wrong, and neither of us wanted to stay out there anymore. When we got back to the rendezvous, we asked if anyone else had heard anything strange, but no one else knew what we were talking about. I know it sounds so anticlimactic, but that call messed me up for a long time. As for the little girl, we never found a trace of her. We keep an eye out for her, and all the other people who we've never found, but frankly I doubt we'll ever find anything. Of the missing persons calls I've gone out on, only a handful have ever resulted in a complete disappearance, meaning no trace of the person and nobody ever found. But sometimes, finding a body just leads me to more questions than answers. Here are some of the bodies we found that have been an infamous on our team. A teenage boy's remains were recovered almost a year after he vanished. We found the top of his skull, 2 finger bones, and his camera almost 40 miles from where he was last seen. The camera, sadly, was destroyed. The pelvis of an older man who had vanished a month earlier, that was all we found. The lower jaw and right foot of a 2-year-old boy on the highest peak of the ridge in the southern part of the park. The body of a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome, almost 20 miles from where she'd vanished. She had died of exposure 3 weeks after going missing, and all of her clothes were intact except for her shoes and jacket. There were berries and cooked meat in her stomach when they did the autopsy. Coroner said that it appeared that someone had been taking care of her. There were no suspects ever identified, though. The frozen body of a 1-year-old baby, found a week after vanishing in the hollow trunk of a tree 10 miles from the area he was last seen. There was fresh milk found in his stomach, but his tongue was gone. A single vertebrae and a right kneecap of a 3-year-old girl found in the snow almost 20 miles from the campground her family had been at the previous summer. Now, on to a couple of the stories my friend told me. I mentioned that you were all interested in the stairs, and you're in luck. He's had a closer encounter with them. Though he doesn't have any explanation for them, he does have a bit more experience with them than I do. My buddy has been a search and rescue officer for about 7 years. He started when he was a junior in college, and he had a very similar experience when he first encountered the stairs. His trainer told him almost the same thing mine did, which was to never go near, touch, or ascend them. For the first year he did just that, but apparently his curiosity got the better of them. And on one call, he broke away from the line and went to go check out the set of them. He said they were about 10 miles from the path where a teenage girl had vanished, and the dogs were following a scent. He was on his own, lagging behind the main group, when he saw a set of stairs off to his left. They looked like they were from a new house, because the carpeting was pristine and white. He said that as he got closer, he didn't feel any different or hear any weird noises. He was expecting something to happen, like bleeding from his ears or collapsing, but he got right up next to them and didn't feel anything. The only thing, he said, that was odd about them, there was absolutely no debris on the steps. No dirt, leaves, dust, anything. And there didn't appear to be any signs of animal or insect activity in the immediate area, which he found very strange. It was less like things were avoiding them. They just happened to be in a relatively barren part of the forest. He touched the stairs and didn't feel anything except that sort of sticky feeling you get from a new carpet. Making sure his radio was on, he slowly climbed the stairs. He said it was terrifying, because of the way they'd been stigmatized. He wasn't really sure what was going to happen to him. He joked that half of him expected to be teleported to some other dimension, and the other half was watching for a UFO to come swooping down. But he got to the top with little event, and he stood there looking around. But, he said the longer he stood at the top step, the more he felt like he was doing something very, very wrong. He described it as the feeling you'd get if you were part of a building you have no business being in, as if someone was going to come and arrest you or shoot you in the back of the head at any second. He tried to brush it off, but the feeling got stronger and stronger, and that's when he realized that he couldn't hear anything anymore. The sounds of the forest were gone, and he couldn't even hear his own breathing. It was like some kind of weird, awful tinnitus, but more oppressive. He climbed back down and rejoined the search, and didn't mention what he'd done. But, he said, the weirdest part came after. His trainer was waiting back at the Welcome Center after the search had ended for the day, and he cornered my buddy before he could leave. He said his trainer had this look of intense anger, and he asked him what was wrong. "You went up them, didn't you?" My buddy said it wasn't phrased as a question. He asked how his trainer knew. The trainer just shook his head. "Because we didn't find her. The dogs lost her scent." My buddy asked what that had to do with anything. The trainer asked him how long he'd been on the stairs, and my buddy said no more than a minute. The trainer gave him this really awful, almost dead-eyed look and told him that if he ever went up another set of stairs again, he'd be fired, immediately. The trainer walked away, and I guess he never answered any of the questions my buddy have asked him since. My buddy has been involved in a lot of missing persons cases where there hasn't been any trace of them found. I mentioned David Pallades, and my buddy said he can confirm that those stories are, for the most part, accurate. He said that most of the time, if the person isn't found right away, they're either never found or they're found weeks, months, or years later in places they couldn't have possibly gotten to. One story he told me really stood out that involved a 5-year-old boy with a severe mental disability. The little boy vanished from a picnic table in the late fall. In addition to the mental disability, he was also physically handicapped, and his parents explained over and over again that he couldn't have simply vanished. That was impossible. Someone had taken him. My buddy said they searched for this kid for weeks, going miles out of the accepted range, but it was like he'd never been out there. The dogs couldn't pick up his scent anywhere, not even in the picnic area where he'd apparently vanished from. Suspicion fell on the parents, but it was pretty clear that they were devastated and hadn't done anything sinister to their kid. The search was concluded about a month later, and my buddy said everyone had pretty much forgotten about it later in the winter. He was out on a training op in the snow, on one of the higher peaks, when he came across something in the snow. He said he saw it from far away first, and when he got closer, he realized it was a shirt, frozen and sticking partway out of the powder. He recognized it as belonging to the kids because of the distinctive pattern. About 20 yards away, he found the kid's body, laying partially buried in the snow. My buddy said there was no way the kid had been dead for more than a few days, even though he'd been missing for almost 3 months. The kid was curled around something, and my buddy brushed off the snow to see what it was. He said he almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was a big chunk of ice that had been carved crudely to look sort of like a person. This kid was holding it so tight it had frostbitten his chest and hands, which my buddy could tell even with the decay that had taken place. He radioed the rest of the crew. They took the body off the mountain. Now, he recapped all of this for me, and to put it simply, there was no way this kid could have both survived for almost 3 months on his own or have gotten to the peak. There was no physical way the child could have walked almost 50 miles and ended up to the top of the damn mountain. To top it off, there was nothing in the kid's stomach or colon. Nothing. Not even water. It was like my buddy said. The kid had been taken off the face of the earth, put in suspended animation, and dropped on the mountain months later, only to die of exposure. He's never really gotten over that one. The last story I'll share from him was one that took place relatively recently, only a few months ago. They were out doing a recon for mountain lions, because there had been several reports of sightings in the last couple of days. One of our jobs is to scout out the areas where these animals are seen, to ensure that if they are in the area, we can warn people and close off those trails. He was out on his own in a very heavily forested part of the park toward dusk when he heard what sounded like a woman screaming in the distance. Now, as most of you know, when a mountain lion screams, it sounds almost exactly like a woman being brutally murdered. It's unsettling, but far from abnormal. My buddy radioed back and let Ops know that he'd heard one, and that he was going to keep seeing if he could figure out where its territory started. He heard the mountain lion scream a couple more times, always from the same spot, and determined the approximate area of the mountain lion's territory. He was about to head back when he heard another scream, this time within only a few yards of him. Of course, he freaks out and starts heading back at a much faster pace, because the last thing he wants is to run into a damn mountain lion and get mauled to death. As he got back on the path and started heading back, the screaming followed him, and he broke into a jog. When he was about a mile from Ops, the screaming stopped, and he turned around to see if it was following him. It was almost night by this point, but he said in the distance, just before the path rounded the corner, he could see what looked like a male figure. He called out to them, warning them that the paths were closed and that he needed to come back to the welcome center. The figure just stood there, and my buddy started to walk over. When he was about 10 yards away, the figure took, as he described, an impossibly long step towards him and let out the same scream my buddy had been hearing. My buddy didn't even say anything. He just turned and sprinted back to the ops, never looking behind him. By the time he got back, the screaming had moved back into the woods. He didn't mention it to anyone else, just said that there was a mountain line in the area that they would need to close the paths until the animal could be located and moved. I'm going to end this entry here, since it's turned into a huge wall of text. I'm going to be heading out to a yearly training op in the morning, so I'll be gone until early next week. I'll be beginning with a lot of former trainers and buddies who work in other areas of the park, and I'll be asking them about stories they'd like to share. I'm so glad you guys have been interested in my stories, and once I'm back from this op, I'll continue to share them. Hey guys, I'm back from my training op, and I have a lot of interesting stories to share with you. I've got enough that I'm going to break them up into 2 parts, this being the first. I'd love to put them all in one entry, but I just haven't had a chance to write them all down yet. I didn't have anything too crazy happen while I was out there, but we did have some incident with a rookie that I found relevant. Since I'm sure you guys have been waiting for these, I'll just get right into the stories. I'll assign each batch of stories to the person who told them to me. KD. KD is a veteran who's been a search and rescue officer for about 15 years. She specializes in high elevation mountain rescues and is widely considered to be one of the best in her field. She was one of the more enthusiastic storytellers, and since we were together a fair amount during exercises, she ended up telling me about 4 that really stuck with me. The first she told me in response to me asking me about her most traumatic call. She shook her head and told me that really bad calls happen more frequently on the mountain, since the potential for nasty accidents is higher. About 5 years ago, one of the parks she worked at had a string of disappearances. It was a bad year, she said, one of the worst on record as far as weather went. They were getting about a foot of new snow every couple of days, and there were a few avalanches that killed some of the climbers. They'd warn people about staying on the mapped areas, but of course there are always those who don't listen. In one particularly nasty case, an entire family got wiped out because the father decided he knew better than the officials, and he took them out to an area that wasn't safe. They were snowshoeing, and as best Katie could figure, they'd walked onto a shelf of snow that looked solid but actually wasn't. It gave way, and this family went ass over tea kettle almost 300 feet down a slope. They landed on the rocks at the bottom, and the parents died instantly. One of the kids did as well, but the other 2 survived. One had a broken leg and fractured ribs, and the other was almost unharmed, save for some bruising and a sprained ankle. The uninjured child left his sibling behind and set out to find help. Katie said the kid didn't make it more than half of a mile before a storm overtook him. Kid stopped to try to get warm, or maybe just to rest, and ended up freezing to death. They ended up finding the family with the help of the witnesses who saw them heading out into the wilderness, and she was the one to find the kid who'd frozen to death, looking for help. She said it had started to snow, just enough to obscure the long-distance vision, but not enough to make searching impossible. She saw a figure sitting in the snow up ahead, and she got to it as quickly as possible. She described in detail how as she got closer she realized first that it was a child, second that they were deceased, and third that they had frozen in one of the most pitiful positions she's ever found a corpse in. The kid was sitting upright, with his knees tucked up against his chest. His arms were curled around him, and his head was tucked into his coat. When she moved to the coat to look at his face, she saw that he'd died crying. His face was twisted, and the tears were frozen on his cheeks. She said it was painfully obvious that the kid was terrified when he succumbed to hypothermia, and as a mother, it broke her heart. She told me repeatedly that she hopes the father is burning in hell as we speak. The other traumatic story she told me that stood out, in my mind, was one that happened to her when she was a rookie. Her team got a report of an experienced climber who hadn't come home the previous day. His wife was convinced that something bad had happened because he never failed to come home on time. They went out looking for him and had to climb what sounded like some very technically challenging parts of the mountain. They got to a relatively flat area, and Katie started seeing blood in the snow. She followed the trail, and as she went, she started seeing little bits of tissue. She wasn't sure exactly what body part it had come from, but the farther she followed it in, the more there was. She follows this blood and tissue trail to a sheltered area under a cliff face, and she finds a climber. She said there was so much blood, more than anything she'd ever seen before. He was lying face down, one arm stretched in front of him, as if he'd died crawling. She looked closer, and sees that he's been partially disemboweled, which is where the tissue she'd seen had come from. The guy has an ice pick tucked in his hip holster, and is covered in blood. Of course, they'll never be sure exactly what happened, but she said it was the best she can figure. This is what went down. The guy had been attempting to climb to the next area, and had been using his ice axe to ascend. He'd probably hit a loose patch and fallen. On the way down, or possibly where he landed, he'd gotten impaled by the axe and it had disemboweled him. He dragged himself along, tearing pieces of himself out as he went, and had died under the cliff face. She isn't terribly bothered by gore, but I guess a few of the guys who came to help her remove the body threw up when they turned him over and a good portion of his intestines spilled out. I mentioned to her that I was interested in hearing about any experience she had with people completely disappearing. Her eyes light up, and she leaned in close to me. "Want to hear a real doozy?" she asked. She tells me about how when she first started, there was a case that got a lot of attention in the media. A family had been out berry picking in an area in a forest very close to the entrance to the park. There had been 2 little boys, under the age of 5, and at some point during the day, one of them vanishes. There's an absolutely massive search, and they find absolutely nothing. It's another one of those cases where it's like the kid was never there in the first place. The dogs just sit down and don't pick up much of anything. No trace of the kid is found. The search goes on for about 2 months, but is eventually called off. Fast forward to 6 months later. The family comes back to place flowers at the memorial that's been set up there for the kid. They bring their other son. While they're placing the flowers, they lose sight of the kid for about 3 seconds, and in that span of time, he vanishes into thin air. Now, obviously, the parents are beyond devastated. It's awful enough to lose one child, but losing 2 is unimaginable. The search is huge, one of the largest in state's history. There are about 300 volunteers combing every inch of this park looking for the kid, but again, there's no trace of him. The search goes on for about a week, with people looking miles from the part of the park he's vanished from. And then, almost 2 weeks later, a volunteer almost 15 miles from the designated area radios that he's found a kid. They assume that the kid was dead, but the volunteer said he's not only alive, he's in good shape. Katie and her team go out to recover the kid, and when they get out there, she can't believe that this is the kid that's been missing. His clothes are clean, and there's no dirt on him anywhere, and it doesn't seem like he's been traumatized. The volunteer says he found the kid sitting along, playing with a little twig bundle that's bound together with some old rope. Katie asks him where he's been, who he has been with for these last 2 weeks, and the kid tells her that he's been with the Fuzzy Man. Now, Katie firmly believes in Bigfoot, so she gets all excited and asks him what he means by fuzzy. Was he hairy? The kid says no, he wasn't hairy, but he was a fuzzy man, and he describes a man that's blurry, like when you close your eyes but not all the way closed. He says the man came out of the trees and took the kid deep into the woods. The kid says he slept in a hollow tree, and the fuzzy man gave him berries to eat. Katie asked if the man was mean, if he scared the kid, and the kid said no, he wasn't scary, but I didn't like how he didn't have eyes. Katie says that they got the kid back to the headquarters, and a cop takes him into town to talk more about what happened. She's friends with the cop that talked to him, and she said the kid described being kept in this tree by the fuzzy man and given berries whenever he was hungry. He was allowed to wander around a very specific clearing, but when he tried to go further, the fuzzy man would get mad and yell real loud even though he didn't have a mouth. When the kid got scared at night, the fuzzy man made it go brighter and gave him the twig bundle. He said the fuzzy man was going to keep him, but he had to let him go because the kid wasn't the right kid. He either can't or won't elaborate more on that. The cops are sort of just left scratching their heads, and the search for his brother is renewed with no results. The kid has no idea where the brother might be, and they never find him. The last story that Katie told me was of something that happened to her when she got separated from a training group when she was a rookie. They were learning the basics of high elevation belaying on a well-mapped site of the mountain, and she had been using the bathroom. She went off about 50 yards from the group during a meal break and did her business. I'll tell you the rest exactly as she told it to me. So I go to take a piss, and once I'm done, I start going back to the group. But I've only gotten about 5 feet when I realize I have no idea where I am. And this wasn't an, oh, I got turned around lost. I mean, I had literally no clue where I was. And if you ask me, I don't even think I'd be able to tell you what state we were in. It was sort of how I imagine people with amnesia feel, you know? You're completely lost and you have no idea what to do. So I stood there for a while just figuring out where the heck I was and what I was supposed to do. But the longer I stand there, the more confused and turned around I get, so I started walking. As I recall, I just picked a random direction and went for it. And as I'm walking, it just keeps getting worse and worse to the point I have no concept why I'm on a mountain in the first place. I'm just trudging through the snow, and that's when I start hearing this voice. It's kind of inside my head, almost like if a frog could talk. It's all low and croaky, and it's telling me over and over, it's okay, you just need to find something to eat. Find something to eat and you'll be okay. Just keep walking and find something to eat. Eat. So I start looking around for anything that I can eat, and I swear to God, I've never felt that hungry in my whole life. It was bottomless, and I think I'd just about eaten anything if you put it right in front of me at that time. I had no concept of time, so I had no idea how long I'd been out there whenever I hear an actual voice coming towards me. I go toward it and I see another search and rescue officer, and he looks terrified. He's running towards me, asking me if I'm okay and what the heck I'm doing out here, and the scary thing was, as if he's running towards me, I kind of see myself reaching into my belt for my hunting knife, not even really thinking about what I'm doing. But what I am thinking about doing is I have to eat. If I don't eat, I'll never be okay again, so I just have to eat. He sees me doing this and backs off right away. He yells at me to put my knife away and that he's not going to hurt me, and that kind of snaps me back. All of a sudden, I know exactly where I am and I put the knife away. I run to him and ask him how long I've been gone, thinking he'll tell me I've been gone for half an hour ago. But he tells me I've been gone for 2 days. I've gone over 2 peaks and ended up almost on the other side of the mountain, and if I kept going, I would have ended up wandering in about 300 miles of wilderness. They never would have found me. He can't believe I'm not dead, and of course I don't know what the heck to think. To me, no time has passed at all. I don't say anything. I just go back with him to a rendezvous point. I'm taken back to HQ to be airlifted to a hospital. When I get there, they do all kinds of tests and try to figure out what happened. At best they can guess, I had some kind of weird fugue state, which is kind of like amnesia, or a weird seizure that knocked my brain out of whack. But the truth is that we really don't know. It's never happened again, but I'll tell you, ever since then I never go out there alone. People rag on me for making them come with when I have to leave the group, but I just tell them listening to me piss in the snow is better than losing me for 2 days on a freezing mountain. The next person I talked to was EW, a former trainer who now works as an EMT. He still comes to ops like this to help out, but doesn't work full time for us anymore. He specialized in finding lost kids. He just seems to have a sixth sense for it when it came to knowing where they'd gone. He's a legend among the more senior vets, but he gets embarrassed if you compliment him on his work. He sat down with me at dinner one evening, and we ended up swapping stories. Most of them were just casual, but when I got on the subject of our more weirder calls, I mentioned that I had a buddy that gone up a set of stairs. He got kind of quiet and asked me if I've heard of this little boy who disappeared from his park a few years back. I hadn't, so he told me the story. They were out looking for this 11-year-old boy, Joey, who'd gone missing near a river. Of course, the first thought that he'd fallen in and drowned, but when they brought the dogs out, they led search and rescue officers away from the river and up to a very densely forested area. When we do searches for people, we search in a grid pattern, and we search every box of the grid incredibly thoroughly. What EW's team noticed right away was that a very strange pattern was emerging. Dogs in alternating boxes were picking up Joey's scent, but losing it when they overlapped with another box. If you think of a checkerboard, Joey's scent was being picked up in random black squares, but never in red. This, of course, didn't make any sense, because how could the kids bounce from area to area without leaving a scent in each place he'd passed? EW and his partner passed a new box into the grid, and EW notices a set of stairs about 50 yards away. He tells his partner that they need to go check near it, but his partner flat out refuses. He tells EW that he's made a point never to go anywhere near any stairs he sees, and that while it may be routine, he's not going to pretend that it's normal. He tells EW that he'll wait in sight while EW checks it. EW says he was irritated, but he felt for the guy, and didn't push him on the subject. I walked over to the stairs. They were small, kind of like stairs in a basement. I don't really feel strongly one way or another about them, the stairs I mean, so I wasn't scared or anything. I guess I'm like everyone else. I just prefer not to talk about them that much. Anyway, I went over and I could see that there was something lying at the bottom of the step, sort of curled up. My heart sinks because of course you always hope for the best, and we were confident that we'd find this kid alive, because he'd only been missing for a few hours, but I knew right away that it was him, and that he was dead. He was curled up in a little ball on the step, holding his stomach. It looked like he'd been in horrible pain when he died, but I don't see any blood except for some on his lips and chin. I radioed in that I found him, and we got his body back to command. That poor family. They were devastated. The parents couldn't understand how he'd be dead, because he'd only been gone for such a short amount of time. And on top of that, we didn't have any obvious cause of death, which just made it worse. I figured he'd probably eaten something poisonous, since he was holding his stomach when I found him, but I didn't want to guess. It's hard enough to hear your kid is dead, let alone have some stupid search and rescue officer guessing about what's happened. They took him away, and I went home to try not to think about it. I hate finding dead kid, man. I love this job, but it's one of the reasons I left. I've got 2 daughters, and the thought of losing them that way he choked up a little here. I'm not great with emotional stuff, and it's always sort of awkward to see a grown man cry, and I didn't really know what to do. He pulled himself together eventually, though, and he kept going. We don't always hear back from the coroners about cause of death. It's not really our job to know. And sometimes they just think it's foul play, but they won't tell us because of legal bullshit. If they think it's foul play, they won't tell us because of legal stuff. But I've got a friend who works for the sheriff's department, and he'll usually pass along any interesting info if I ask. In this case, though, I actually got a call from him about a week later. He asked if I remember the kid, and of course I do. And he says some seriously weird stuff is going on. He tells me, EW, man, you're going to think I'm crazy, but the coroner has no idea what happened to this kid. He's never seen anything like it. My friend goes on to tell me that when the coroner opened the kid up, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The kid's organs were like Swiss cheese. Quarter-sized holes were punched clean through just about every single organ this kid had, aside from his heart and lungs. But his colon, his stomach, his kidneys, and every one of his testicles were full of these clean holes. My friend said the coroner described it as someone has taken a hole punch and punched holes out of everything. They were so neat. but the kid didn't have a single scratch on him. No entry or exit wounds. The closest anyone there had ever seen like it was a guy who'd filled himself with a buckshot over a year ago while cleaning his rifle. No one had a clue what could possibly have caused it. My friend asked me if there had been anything like it, or if we had similar cases in the past, but I've never even heard of something like that. And I told him I wasn't going to be any help to him. As far as I know, the coroner determined the cause of death something like massive internal bleeding, but no one knows what really happened. I've never been able to forget that kid. I have nightmares about it sometimes. I don't let my kids go into the woods alone. And when we go together, I never let them out of my sight. I used to love it out here, but that case and a couple others just sort of ruined it for me. Dinner was over, so we started to clean up and go back to our cabins. Before we went our separate ways, he put his hand on his shoulder and looked at me really close. He tells me that there are bad things out there, things that don't care if we have families or lives, or that we can think and feel. He tells me to be careful and walks away. I didn't have a chance to talk to him again, but that story stuck with me. By pure coincidence, I got to talk to another vet, PB, who's been in the search and rescue field for years. We were partnered on a grid sweep during a training exercise, and we were chatting casually about how we liked the job, what kind of things we'd seen, and the like. At one point, we passed by an old set of stairs, though these were probably from an old fire lookout, given the area that we were in. I sort of casually mentioned that I was curious about the stairs and that I wish I knew more about them. He got kind of quiet and looked like he wanted to tell me something, but wasn't sure if he should. Finally, he told me to turn my radio off. Obviously, this is something we are never supposed to do, but I did it, and he did the same. About 7 years ago, he tells me, he was out on a call with a rookie. They were in an area of the park that's had a lot of strange reports and events. Disappearances, stories about the lights in the forest, odd noises, things like that. The rookie was totally spooked, kept going on and on about things out in the woods. According to PB, the guy just wouldn't stop talking about the goat man, just on and on, goat man this and goat man that. Finally, I told him there was plenty else to be afraid of out here that was very real, and that he'd better get over this thing with the goat man. The rookie wanted to know what kinds of things I was talking about, and I just told him to shut up and walk. We crested a little ridge, and there was a staircase about 10 yards ahead. The rookie stops dead in his tracks and just stand there looking at him. I tell him, "See? That's something you should be afraid of." The rookie asked me what the hell these are doing out here, and for some reason I just opened up and tell him the truth, or what I've been told is the truth. I could have gotten in a lot of trouble for doing what I did, and I could get in a lot of trouble for repeating it to you, but you're a nice kid, and I want to tell you to stop looking into this. Quit while you're ahead. So I'll tell you what I know, under the condition that you never breathe a word of this to the Soups. I told him I wouldn't say a word, and he double checks that our radios are off. When I first started off, we were a little bit less tight-lipped about them, and the other things that happen out here. We warned people before they were even hired that there was weird stuff going on. I guess the Forest Service was tired of having such a massive turnover rate, and they wanted people to know what they were getting into. So they started having people sign these agreements that they wouldn't go to the media about what they were going to see. The Forest Service didn't want to scare people away, so the last thing they needed were spooked rookies running off to the media with stories of ghosts and haunted stairs. But eventually, they found out that the agreements weren't necessary. People not only didn't want to talk about what they saw, they wouldn't. A few times, media tried to talk to people when kids or hikers would disappear, and no one would say a word. I can't really explain it. I guess we just don't really want to admit anything is wrong. This is our job, to be out in the woods every single day, and we don't need to be spooked, and the best way to avoid that is to pretend like everything okay. So I'll tell you everything I can think of, and after that I'm done talking about it for good, and I expect you to not bring it up around me, ever. The stairs have been out here for as long as the parks have existed. We have records going back decades describing them. Sometimes people go up them and nothing happens. Other times, look, I don't really like talking about this, but sometimes really bad stuff happens. I saw one guy get his hand sliced clean off when he got to the top step. He reached out to touch a tree branch, and it happened so fast. 1 second his hand was there, and the next it was gone. Completely clean wound. We didn't find his hand, and the guy almost died. Another time a woman touched one of the stairs, and a blood vessel or her brain exploded. Literally exploded, like a water balloon. She sort of stumbled down and came over to me, and all she got out was, "I think something is wrong with me." She dropped like a sack of flour, dead, before she could even hit the ground. I'll never forget the way the blood leaked into the inside of her eye. Before she died, I watched it turn red. I watched it happen, and there was a single thing I could do to help. We warned people not to go anywhere near them, but there's always at least one idiot who does. And even if nothing bad happens to them, something bad always happens. Kids go missing when we're on the trail, someone dies the next day, cut in half completely in a safe part of the park. I don't know why, but something bad always happens. I don't know exactly why they're out here, but it doesn't matter. They're here, and if we were smart, we'd tell our new officers exactly what they're capable of. We were both quiet for a little while. I was afraid to talk because I wasn't sure if he was done. He looked like he wanted to say something else. Finally, he spoke up again. "Have you ever noticed how you can't find the same ones twice?" I nodded, expecting him to continue, but he just stayed quiet. walking alongside me, and eventually he started a story about the biggest deer he'd ever seen in the park. I didn't bring up the subject again, and I didn't press him for any more stories. He dropped out of the op the next day. Apparently, he left before the sun came up. He said he was sick. None of us have ever heard from him again since he's left. I'm going to stop here for the time being. I'll try and post the next part in the next coming days, but what with it being the end of the summer, things are pretty busy here. Thanks for the continued interest, guys. You've really awakened this curiosity in me that I didn't know I had. That was the first part of the DJ Lucky Menace Halloween special. If you've liked what you heard so far, I've got great news for you, as I'm going to continue for the second part of this series next week at my normally scheduled time from 5 to 6 p.m. on Wednesday, November 6th. Thank you so much, and I hope you've enjoyed your Halloween so far. This has been DJ Lucky Menace.